Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SOA Software webcast series. I hope you have been enjoying our webcast series. We have done a bunch of these over the last year. We have a great lineup of very interesting and thought leadership topics around API management and SOA planned for 2014 as well. Today's topic is API and SOA, and are they two sides of the same coin? It's a very interesting and quite hotly debated topic. There's a lot of people who kind of think that API and SOA are same, some who think they're entirely different, some think APIs are replacing SOA. There are all kind of opinions over there. So to provide more insight, more deep insight about APIs and SOA, we have today with us the speakers who are Alistair Farquharson. Alistair is the CTO of SOA Software. Alistair is responsible for all vision and strategy, and he runs all of engineering for SOA Software. Alistair has been at the forefront of many technology waves, from enterprise web architecture through web services and SOA, and now he's a leading visionary and thought leader in the API space. And then I will be, along with Alistair, yours truly, Sachin Agarwal, who's VP of Product Marketing at SOA Software. So before we jump onto the webinar, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. So there are a bunch of, can we get to the next slide?
I thought I was going to do headphones, but I'll...
The slide after this, next slide, please. Yeah, a little bit of housekeeping. So we have a ton of very useful information that you can go and look at in the Resource Center. All our webinars from the past as well as this webinar will be recorded. You can find these recordings at the URL over there, http://resource.soa.com/resource/webinars. We'll also be sending out an email with the link to the recording for the current webinar. And also to keep up to date with what's going on at SOA Software, please follow us on the following social channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter, wherever you are. There are a lot of updates about what we are doing, our white papers, our thought leadership, our events that we go to, product releases, everything is going on over here. So with that, on to the next slide. And really, I mean, I want to start with asking Alistair about SOA. So SOA has been around for a while, Alistair. What was to the core of SOA? What was so attractive about SOA that it got adopted so widely? What was kind of the reason why SOA came around, and then what were some of its limitations?
Thanks, Sachin. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, good. So I think that historically it's really interesting to look at SOA and to look at APIs as a new iteration potentially of SOA. But if I think back at SOA and the start of SOA, it really started off very similarly to APIs. There was a promise of new revenue and new channels for the business, and even the Internet of Things was at the tip of everyone's tongue. I remember one analogy of soda dispensing machines being able to raise the cost of soda based on the weather, and that was, 12 years ago. And now we see with Google's acquisition, they can now, raise the temperature of your home. So APIs have kind of become the realization of SOA, but it's not really anything that new. I just think that SOA, to a large extent, was somewhat before its time. So if you think about 5, 10 years ago even, the demand for APIs just wasn't there. The demand for what we called at the time services was not there, or at least external services. There was no Internet of Things really, not practically. And mobile applications and native mobile applications were still really in the infancy compared to today. I'd love to see where we are in 10 years' time. It's going to be a completely different life, and our children are never going to talk to us. But the fact of the matter is that 5 to 10 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of demand for external services, at least not in the same context as there is for APIs today. So I think the result of that was that SOA kind of turned inwards. The concept of service orientation turned inwards, even though that was not necessarily the initial goal. And the promise of making money became a promise of reuse. So businesses became, or started to refactor their internal IT departments as service-oriented. And the adoption of the standards by all of the vendors really accelerated SOA and made it what it was. So if you think about what the successful things about SOA were, or at least what drove it, it became this promise of reuse after the buzz died down, and it became, or it has become, something that is as a result of the adoption of a set of standards. So I think that sort of describes why SOA is still today and was so extremely popular. I mean, it was at least as popular as APIs were, and an incredible number of success stories out there of people implementing service-oriented architecture and saving a great deal of money. But let's look at the limitations or the potential limitations of SOA. So I think that the problem with SOA, and I'll talk about APIs a little bit later on, and things specific to APIs later on, and why APIs are so lucky. So I think that the world ultimately is complex, and there are complex issues, and it requires support and skills to really do things correctly. I mean, if you think about SOA and the fact that SOA started to be used for the integration of applications, that's a serious concern. That is a complicated thing to do. To integrate an integration and the cost of integration and the technologies behind integration and all of the concerns behind integration are complex. Also, if an organization wanted to do SOA and wanted to do SOA for the purposes of reuse and try to achieve that return on investment, you kind of needed the whole company behind you. We saw a lot of failures, and we still do today. We see a lot of failures where companies do not adopt SOA wholesale. They try to create a set of services, and really they haven't driven down the principles of reuse through their organization, and essentially they just have instead of having a whole bunch of applications being rebuilt over and over again, they just have a whole bunch of services being rebuilt over and over again. And services are looked as an integration technology, not as a way to actually create a service orientation. So the complexity around that and the fact that you really need your whole company behind an SOA initiative becomes a limitation of the technology itself and makes it hard. It makes it challenging to actually do correctly. Once it is done correctly, it's a huge cost saver, and I'm not debating that. But it is actually a challenging thing to do. Whereas APIs are somewhat lucky, and I'll talk about this later on, in that they are relatively easy to do. So since SOA sort of became an integration technology, it became sophisticated. And I deliberately use the term sophisticated versus the term complicated because real world always interferes with nice, clean, simple ideas. If I think back to SOAP was Simple Object Access Protocol. It was supposed to be simple. And along came real-world scenarios. People wanted to secure it. People wanted to make it transactional. People wanted it to work on multiple protocols, simply because those were the real-world concerns they had with application integration behind their firewall. So services, XML services, SOAP services, became complicated because the real world started to intrude of those. So the sophistication of the protocol was a limitation at the end of the day to its adoption, or is a limitation to the end of the day, to its adoption. Also, the fact that you need the organization behind you if you want to realize real value and real return on investment from reuse. The third reason is a little bit more pragmatic. I think that human readability, or just the readability of the set of technologies, is a challenge. And this is something that has been improved on greatly with APIs. And I'm going to make the point later on that APIs is just another different type of service. And I'll talk about that a lot through my webinar. But I think readability plays a very, very big role in the adoption of these things. There's not a lot of people out there that really understand WSDL, as an example, and even fewer people out there that ever really grasped or cared to grasp UDDI. So that really kind of brings me to a diagram I have over here. Hold on a second. If you think about the common components in a services architecture, and this has parallels with APIs as well, you have a catalog, which is where you put all your stuff. Then you have a consumer on the right-hand side, and they need to figure out how to actually access that particular API. And then you have a provider on the left-hand side, which is the actual server that is hosting the API. And these were the common components. If you look at any services architecture going back to Corba, and maybe even before that, these are the common kind of components of a service orientation. And they are still the common components of API. And I'll talk about that in a second. But if you look specifically at the more traditional, perhaps, protocols and standards around SOA, we had UDDI, and we had WSDL, and we had SOA. And that was kind of the axis of evil, so to speak, when it came to services and the technologies around services. The idea was that the UDDI standard would provide a consistent way to discover services and the associated metadata. But as a sign of, I guess, things to come, this UDDI standard, while ratified, really lost support. And I believe that this is due to two very big reasons. The first one being inflexibility. The thing was very, very sort of strongly typed and very, very rigid and had very, very few extensibility mechanisms. And just the basic lack of human readability about the specification. All of these things were designed for machine-to-machine interoperability. Nobody really gave a damn in this axis of evil about the developer themselves. And that is one of the things that makes, services or traditional SOAP services difficult to use because they're difficult to understand. And conversely, it's the thing that makes APIs popular in that it is readable, and we have tried to keep them as simple as possible. So when you look at these three things, you can kind of see parallels to the API world today, but you can also see some of the failings that happened with SOA. I'm not going to beat on SOA a lot during this presentation, but I'm going to go on to why, I'm going to beat a little bit on why APIs lack some of the things that SOA has and why they should add them.
Okay, so it's essentially like what you're kind of implying is the basic tenets of SOA around service reuse are extremely valid. I mean, they kind of simplified the architecture. They became kind of core of integration strategy within an enterprise. But some of the implementations like WSDL, UDDI, so they were, I guess, a little bit more complex that led to its limitations.
Yeah, we have to be very careful because if the real world always complicates things, and that's what I say every single time. So if I look at APIs today and I look at JSON, and I look at JSON schema, and then I look at documentation standards out there that are now describing APIs and describing schema or equivalents of schema, like JSON schema and Swagger and all of these things, they're all analogs to WSDL. If anybody, and I'm sure there are lots of people on the call, really deeply understand the OWL spec, they realize that it's complicated, right? So what happens is things always start off simple. Things always start off with a very, very clear use case. But the real world starts interfering with things, and it's very, very easy to condemn a technology set because it's complicated and because it takes a lot of time. But the danger that human beings, or the pitfalls that human beings always fall into, is they always like, or they always can easily understand, obviously, the simple things. But then the real world, after you've thought about it for several months, you start to realize that, hey, well, APIs are great, but I can't do any change management. I can't do any controls. I need to describe this thing. I need to somehow create a descriptor. I need to create a repository. I need to do all of these things. And you tend to repeat history. So it's very, very easy for us to condemn history because it's too complicated, but at the same time, we always make things complicated. We're human beings, and the real world is complex, or sophisticated, for want of a more palatable marketing term. But the fact of the matter is, I think that the biggest downfall of SOA is that it was really designed for machine-to-machine interoperability and really left out the developer. I mean, you have to overcome a lot of, or you have to really educate yourself quite considerably before you can actually do it right. APIs in general, JSON, the fact that JSON is simpler than XML, the fact that documentation is easier for a human being to read than WSDL, the fact that developer portals are easier to use than UDDI. All of these things contribute to a simpler adoption curve, a flatter adoption curve for APIs versus services. So I think that there's something to be learned by APIs from SOA and vice versa. That was a long answer to your question, but
no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I think moving on a little bit on this, I mean, so do you want to kind of compare a little bit about what UDDI obviously has, and then second one, which you might want to answer later, is you mentioned API, you mentioned Waddle and Swagger and a bunch of those things. So I would also like you to talk a little bit about later, like, why has API been such a rage? They have been around for a while too. I mean, 4 or 5 years since APIs started. So what were the limitations of SOA that APIs address? So if you can answer these two.
Yeah, sure. The reason that APIs are so popular is because of demand. It's a free market economy out there, and basically the mobile apps and all of the and the real uprising of the Internet of Things and the API economy, it's all being driven by demand. It's all being driven by a slow change in perception and the way that programmers work with companies. And I think that more than anything else is why APIs are popular. It's not necessarily due to the technology, and I'll get onto this in a minute. It's all basically due to the fact that people foresee or people see opportunity with APIs, but that opportunity is not one that is a technical opportunity. It's a business opportunity. So if I have a diagram over here, let me skip over a whole bunch of these diagrams here. So if you think about an API, the reason it is so popular is because it's connecting you to all of these devices. If I think pragmatically about it, if I have a mobile application and everybody wants a mobile application, and there are twice as many users that have mobile devices as there are users that have PCs, or whatever the latest statistics are, you can see that just the sheer demand for APIs is growing, and the sheer demand for externally facing services, whether they be APIs or WSDL or APIs or XML or whatever it is growing. So the reason that APIs are so popular today is not necessarily because of a huge change in technology. It's more because of demand from mobile devices and web technologies that are really looking for an API that they can integrate with. So I don't necessarily think that it is because of a change in the protocols or because of a change in the standards that have occurred. I think it's simply because of the demand of the devices and the technologies that are out there. They tend to dictate a certain protocol and certain set of standards because certain protocols and standards work better with certain mobile devices. But organizations need to be careful that they don't lock themselves into one particular protocol or one particular standard just because it's popular today. I mean, we're seeing a lot of JSON REST right now, but we're seeing an incredible amount of XML. We're also seeing a rise in the amount of WebSockets and other protocols coming along. So REST is popular today. It's not going to be popular tomorrow. People are going to move on, maybe not from REST, but surely from JSON potentially. And the messaging patterns are going to change based on the types of applications you're supporting. So I think it's a mistake to consider APIs and align them very closely with the technology. I think it's far more important to think about what opportunities are you trying to capture with APIs? And this is what makes APIs successful, and this is what was missing 5, 10 years ago with services. This demand was not there for services. So, technologies evolved as they always do, but the demand has now emerged for externally facing interfaces of various protocols. And the reason for that is that mobile applications and web frameworks today, that's the way that they talk to their back end. So whole new opportunities have come out as these technologies have emerged. So businesses are looking to drive innovation. They're looking to create a new channel for their business. They're looking to acquire new users. And all of these things are opportunities that have been presented more recently and have driven the demand for APIs.
Right. So one of the things that also APIs make easy is with the publishing of the APIs on an open portal, what's known as traditionally an API portal. So can you compare like the API portal with the UDDI or the repository approach that we had in SOAP or SOA?
Yeah. So it's very easy to say that the repository and registry are dead. That is very easy to say, and I think it's a tendency for human beings to always go and grasp the newest and simplest things first because they're easier to understand, and it's very appealing to do that. But I think that there's a place for both. So obviously, if you're going to be externally marketing your API, you are sure as heck not going to use UDDI. That thing is awful, and it's debatably dead. What you want to do is you want to create a developer portal. You want to create an experience that those developers are used to and that they want to interact with. So the advent of the developer portal has come out. We have a SaaS platform that you can brand, and it's a multi-tenant platform that you can brand to host your developer portal. But it's basically a website. It's a website as much as your storefront is a website, in that you are figuring out what the business value is of your API. You're trying to attract new developers. You have calls to action. You have syndication. You have marketing. You have pretty pictures, and you have documentation. And you're really trying to connect with a developer, human being at the other end. And you're trying to give them an experience that they're used to, that they're familiar with. They've been integrating. They're coming out of college now. They've been playing with Facebook APIs and Twitter APIs. They're kind of used to this concept of writing applications that leverage third-party APIs in almost everything that they do. So you want to give them an experience that's similar to that. So the whole API portal is emerged over the past few years. It's consumer-facing, and it really does appeal to the mobile and web app consumer. So the point I'm trying to make here is it's fundamentally different to the registry technologies, which were all about how does a machine communicate. UDDI was an interface. It was a standard specification for how you could look up and discover services. It was very, very bad at dealing with human beings. I don't know if anyone on the call ever logged into an old UDDI server, but the thing was impregnable. It was very, very difficult to figure out what was going on. It was really designed for a huge volume of internal services, and it was designed to be navigable and addressable and interfaced by other applications. I don't think anyone ever thought about what a human being or how a human being should use that thing. The complete opposite is the API portal, which really doesn't have any standards around it at all. It's effectively a website, and it's all about marketing and presenting your APIs outside of the organization. So what's basically happened over the course of time is the pendulum has swung from something that's completely unfriendly and obscure for a human being to something that is very marketing oriented and externally facing. But over time, what happened with the SOA space is the SOA space evolved from registries and that old nasty UDDI specification. It evolved to something which was more of a repository. So internal to organizations, they kind of stopped using UDDI. That was considered passe, and they started using repositories. And repositories were all about what is the workflow and what is the development process of building services. And it was far more developer-oriented. So internally, developers would use it. It had a nice web user interface, and people stored inside this thing the reusable services and components and schemas and documents that they used for their day-to-day development tasks internally. And it also managed the life cycle of service development. So now we kind of have these two different things. We have the SOA repository, which stores services and APIs and documents and all of those things, but it's internal. And then we have the developer portal, which is primarily external. Well, the way that I like to look at it is that repository is used for the production lifecycle of an API or service, and the developer portal is used for all of the consumption aspects of the API lifecycle. And the reason for this is quite simple. Internal development is sophisticated, complex, however you want to look at it. But if you think about an API as the tip of the iceberg, and I have a diagram to show this a little bit later on, the API is something that is typically an aggregation of a bunch of internal applications. Most of us on this call, at least I think, have a lot of different back-end systems. You know, maybe you're a bank, maybe you have 10,000 of these things. So an API call coming in is going to be calling a lot of different systems, aggregating things together, and ultimately exposing, you know, JSON documents or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that internally, when you look at the development of that API, it depends on a set of back-end services, a set of back-end systems, and maybe a bunch of different development teams from different lines of businesses all have to build aspects of that API, or at least open up their systems to some extent that an API can make those calls. So if you just look at the API, it's kind of putting the blinkers on. What you're not considering is the work that has to go into on the back end to support that API. So that is still, I believe, controlled by the repository. What are the different development streams? What is the development lifecycle of the API? And what is the development lifecycle of all the services that support that API? Whereas the portal is everything that's outward facing. It's the marketing. It's the flashy, developer facing, outbound, consumer oriented marketing and business platform for publishing that API. There might be one API on the front end and 200 services or systems on the back end. And that's kind of how I like to divide it. I like to divide it between the production and the consumption of that API, where that API is kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Fair. So that's a very interesting point. So the repository is kind of, it's a great piece of technology. It's handling the production side. It's handling the complexity, the internal complexities of enterprises. The API portal is more on the consumption side to make it really easy to market, to make it really easy for other users to come in and start consuming it. But at the same time, you said, API is essentially, if you look at APIs currently in that terms is REST and JSON. When we talk about SOA, essentially that has connotations with SOAP. So do you think SOA has been perceived as an overarching IT initiative. It has been there, it's still with IT, but it has potentially long timelines. How do you think the two models, like the API model, which is more of the consumption model, and the SOA model, which is more of the production model, coming together, or do you think these are different models and should stay different? What are your thoughts about API and SOA together, or they're different?
Well, it depends on how you look at it, right? So if you think of APIs as externally facing and services as internal, then they are going to be different in terms of their project life cycles. And I think it's very, very important to consider APIs and services based on who the audience is. But I think that it's very, very risky to assume that APIs don't need services and services aren't APIs. So let me take a couple of steps back for a second here. I think I have, actually I'll show this diagram a little bit later on. APIs are lucky, and I mentioned this before. So APIs are very, very lucky. And the reason I say that is for well, it's kind of three reasons that come to mind. The first one is that they have funding, okay? So one of the fundamental things that makes an API, I believe an API, is that it is funded as an API. It's a product, and the business perceives it as a product, and they are going to market with an API, and they are spending dollars on it, they are exposing it through this portal. As much as if they were selling a car, they are going to go out and promote this API. So it has funding. And that was one of the things about services that was always a challenge. You always had to try and figure out how you were going to fund a service orientation because it was across different projects. But if there was a way, and I believe that there always should be, and we always recommended this to our customers, is when they were embarking on an SOA, get funding for the services themselves. Don't try and shoehorn it into different project budgets. And that was one of the big things, one of the big business problems that we have today around SOA is that it's difficult to get that funding for that service because they can't figure out which line of business to put it in. APIs are lucky because they get business funding because it's funded by marketing or it's funded by some line of business that is trying to achieve a very specific business outcome. They're trying to expose an API, they're trying to sell more underpants. Whatever it is, that API has that business focus and that business funding. The second thing is, while not always the case, but typically it's a green field. So an API, when you publish it, especially today, especially now as APIs are still emerging, they don't have a lot of legacy stuff to deal with, right? So they don't have to expand the protocols to include a whole bunch of stuff. Oh, how are we going to support transactionality? Oh, my word, how do we support Kerberos? Oh, my word, I have a whole bunch of JMS-style services. What do I do with those? They don't have those problems, right? They can go out and publish an API extensively in a green field. The third thing is that APIs are benefiting from a shift. I talk about this all the time, but a shift in the sense of gravity. And what I mean by that is people who are emerging on the job market today understand APIs and understand that the API is what the API is. You can't go to Facebook and say, oh, your API is terrible, please change it for me. That doesn't happen, right? They look at the API and they have an arm's length relationship with that API, or at least the people that are exposing that API, and they consume that API as much as they would consume a pair of shoes. They don't go back to the manufacturer and say, I want this in blue. The manufacturer, who is massive and is churning out millions of these shoes, is not going to listen to them and not going to make it blue. And they kind of understand that, right? But with internal services, you have to deal with a lot of different politics and a lot of different customers, and each one wants a different flavor of this particular shoe or a different color of this particular shoe. I don't think people eat shoes, but you kind of get the idea, right? So people who are entering the technology market today understand this relationship that they have with APIs. So people can build an API for a huge consumer audience. They have the funding, they have a green field, and if they focus just on the tip of that iceberg and not worry about anything else, it's easy. It's quick, it's easy, and it's demonstrable. And that is something that is very, very powerful about an API. And it's something that you should strive to get with SOA as well. And we've always talked about SOA like this. In fact, when I look at APIs, I'm like, that is what SOA is. Because when you think about a service, you need to get it funded. You need to try and make it as greenfield as possible. You need to shift the center of gravity. People need to look at it as a service. They can't come back and say, I don't like it that way. I want it in blue. That's the way it is. And maybe we will, accept all input, and the next version of it might be a little bit different. But basically, I'm operating this thing as a profit center, or as a cost center, depending on how you look at it. It's managed as a product, even internally. And there should be very, very few of them. When I walk into a customer and they have 1,000 services, I'm like, you don't. You just have a whole bunch of HTML and XML flying over the wire. You don't have a set of services. So, APIs are lucky in that regard. So when I look at an API and I think about what makes an API, they are not distinguished by the technologies at all. Those three factors, the business funding, the greenfield, and the shifted center of gravity, that's what makes an API. And the human readability I spoke about earlier and the output facing of it. It's got nothing to do with the protocol. An API can be so. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. You should just choose the technology and the protocol based on what your consumer is looking for and what devices they have and what the programming style is. You are going to move from REST and JSON into whatever comes next, I guarantee it. And you should not sweep API under the rug just because you've swept JSON under the rug. You need to keep the fundamentals in place, and maybe the three-letter acronyms change or the four-letter acronyms change, but basically the concepts stay the same when it comes to APIs. The technology is always going to change. So I have another diagram here somewhere. Let me go backwards a bit here. Sorry about this. I know I have it somewhere. No, I guess not. There's a lot of things that are in common between APIs and services, or at least traditional services. I will find the diagram shortly. Basically, if you look at a service or an API, it has a lot of the same requirements. You have lifecycle. You need to worry about the lifecycle of your API. How is that API published? How is that API built? What things does it depend on? What is the development lifecycle? What are the standards and practices you're going to be following? All of those things that fall into this bucket of governance. A lot of people don't like to hear that word, but you don't want to put a bad API out there. And it's fine and it's easy when you do your first one. You have the best people on it, you have laser focus, but I guarantee that that's going to not scale particularly well. And those really intelligent people are going to leave and go to another company where they can be perceived as intelligent again. So the problem around APIs and the production of APIs is that you do still need to take care of those things, and you need to figure out how you're going to scale and how you're going to manage it. Then there's analytics. Services, internal services, as well as external APIs, whatever the technology, you need analytics. You need orchestration. You need quality of service and monitoring. You need transformation. If you're converting from JSON and REST today to XML on the back end, how are you going to expose something that is leveraging WebSockets? You're going to want to do transformation somewhere within this platform, this API platform. Security. Security just changes. The demands on security don't change. The different protocols change, yes, but the need for security does not. And the ability to mediate between different kinds of security does not change. It only grows, right? We have OpenID Connect, we have OAuth that has to mediate WS security, we have transport level security, we have SSL, we have all these different kinds of things, and you have a set of back-end systems. You're going to be exposing what you think is cutting-edge, state-of-the-art today, but 3 weeks down the line, you're going to have to invent a new protocol or come up with something different to plug a hole or to adopt a new technology or standard that's out there. Security standards change. So don't dismiss the security standards that exist with WS security because they're old. The stuff that we're using today is going to be old very soon. The concept of business services, where it's a product and it's built as a product. I say that these things are important to both APIs as well as web services. You need to perceive a service as a product. And then ultimately these things fan apart when you look at protocols. And this is the point I'm trying to make, is XML RPC, SOAP, REST, Corba, WebSockets, whatever the case is, that's going to be an ever-diverging set of technologies. But what I guarantee today is that you're still going to have that internal development lifecycle for the production of these interfaces, whatever they are, and then you're still going to have now, because of the demand, you're still going to have now the external-facing developer portal, which has to be human readable and serves as a marketing platform for whatever API or technology or whatever it's going to be called in 3 weeks' time. So you need to look at what do I need to do to safely produce services or APIs or XYZs, and what do I need to do to market and promote these API services, XYZs, and products to the outside world. So that was, again, a long answer to a short question.
This is great. So what essentially you are trying to imply over here is like API and SOA are services to a certain extent, and there are a lot of things over here on the left side of the diagram, which is lifecycle, analytics, orchestration, QoS, transformation, security, which from an infrastructure perspective should actually be shared across all these services. And then the protocols will come and go. I mean, we had RPC a long time back. There was Corba, SOAP, and then now obviously there's REST, and then we'll probably, like you mentioned, we'll see MQTT and WebSockets. So protocols will come and go. And there's probably a thin layer that you need to address these protocols, but your basic service infrastructure, that needs to be solid and that needs to work across all of these things. So that's a great insight. I mean, so as a technical architect, a lot of people who are out here right now, they come from a technical background. I mean, they're technical architects and as a developer. So what are the things that they need to take care to make their API successful? I mean, just from, and I'm using API over here as a loosely termed word, like API is more of a service, but what do you think are the tenets of making an API program successful, and what should be the underlying infrastructure or technology to address that?
Okay, let me go one step back a little bit and sort of summarize the points I think I've been trying to make. So basically, if you think about what people perceive today as services, and I think that what I believe is that APIs is a superset of services. An API today is what a service always should be, and people should strive to create a product around even an internal service. And I think that the biggest problem was that SOA, in its focus on machine-to-machine integration, forgot about the human being in the equation. And the pendulum has swung all the way to the other side. And APIs, in their focus on ease of use and consumption only, have kind of forgotten about management and control. And I think that you need to sit somewhere in the middle there. Services can benefit from the usability, the readability, the accessibility of APIs. And APIs need to take a page out of SOA's book in terms of control and management. And I don't just necessarily mean security and flashing lights and pretty charts. I'm referring to lifecycle, and I'm referring to change management, and I'm referring to impact analysis. If you expose an API outside of your organization, what back-end services is it using? Is it hitting a mainframe system ultimately at the end of the day that costs $1 per transaction? What is the set of relationships? If you focus just on the API, just on the tip of that iceberg, and build up a piece of infrastructure around just the tip of that iceberg, then you have no idea what is really happening underneath that. And you have no accountability within your organization and a set of back-end systems to expose that API. So a successful API really needs a good, solid platform or management system. It needs a good design. It needs an effective implementation. And then at the end of the day, it needs quality program management. So what you need is a comprehensive solution that covers the control and management of services and APIs in a single platform, because you want to, in a single pane of glass, be able to see the API calls that are coming in and then what services are being invoked on the back end. You want to be able to seamlessly leverage our cloud-based SaaS offering, for instance, and be able to track a transaction from that cloud-based SaaS offering into your organization through your gateway, ultimately to 3 or 4 back-end systems, to find out why are you messing up your SLA, or what is the ultimate cost of this particular API call? or to preserve the integrity of the identity of the user all the way to the back-end systems and to see what's going on. And then to measure the impact of change. What happens if I change one of these back-end systems? Does it affect my API or doesn't it? So you need to come up with, basically you need to extend your services infrastructure to cover your API infrastructure as well. And it needs to extend beyond the boundary of your organization into the cloud as well. Because the majority, or not the majority, but we're seeing a huge move to the cloud, both for development, for integration, for hosting, and everything. It's all moving to the cloud. So you are ultimately going to have a services-oriented architecture and an API initiative, one and the same thing, all in the cloud, integrating perhaps with some real boat-anchored systems that you might still have internally. But a lot of your development and things are going to be moving to the cloud, and a lot of your integration is going to be into the cloud. So you're going to need to understand what is the set of relationships. And if that isn't a service orientation, I just don't know what is. I mean, it's all about consuming services and integrating between these different systems, exposing an API that's consumed by 50 or 100 different mobile applications from different third parties, and you want to see, you want to have visibility into what's going on, and you want to control the life cycle and development of those services. So you need a platform to support a combined API and services initiative. You can't just focus on the lipstick on that pig. You have to really look at the full picture and figure out what is the relationship, what are the mediations, what are the transformations, how do I actually get API calls in, and how do I serve them from the back end? What is the larger picture? Now you can definitely do one or the other, of course, with our products. We don't mind if we're just the lipstick. That's fine. And you can treat everything on the back end as a black box and not worry about services lifecycle management, or API lifecycle, or the API production lifecycle. But I think that there's a lot of danger in that. And the temptation is that you can get a very, very quick win with APIs without really understanding what the effect is on the back end. There are benefits in doing that to claim an early win, but I think that you always have to have in your mind, how am I going to mature my infrastructure over time, and how am I going to grow from maybe a tactical API program to meet the needs of one application to what's going to become a real channel for your business over time. So I like to think that we as a vendor cover both aspects. We cover the life cycle of services. We understand how services get built internally. We understand APIs as a superset of services. And we understand all of the outbound marketing, production, product management aspects of taking that API and promoting it outside of your organization, both in the cloud and on-premise. So you need a platform. You need to design the API effectively. You need to implement it correctly, scalably, etc. And then you need to do a lot of program management around how do you take that API and promote it to your partners and to the outside world. So those are kind of the four things that I see that you really need for an effective API program. And we've really only spoken on this webinar about the platform. The design, the implementation, and the program management, these are things that you need to think about as a developer or as a program manager. And we'll probably cover those in other webinars, or you can come to our website and see what we do around that as well.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. So at this point in time, we'll open it for a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you have, please send them through the chat channel. We'll also unmute the line, so if you have any that you want to ask online, you can ask them. There are a few, Alistair, that I already have. So the first one is, isn't it the responsibility of the SOA infrastructure provider to provide interoperability between the protocols?
I'm not sure the context of the question, but it all depends on what you mean by the SOA infrastructure provider. So yes and no. So if you look, for example, at the promise of an ESB, and an ESB, a services bus, can provide that mediation between different systems and so on and so forth. But it could also be a gateway. So yes, I believe that the SOA infrastructure vendor, the gateway vendor, so to speak, using the terminology that we use, is responsible for providing that mediation between different protocols. So you might have a set of services on the back end, XML services, on a variety of different protocols that have been supported over the past few years, and you now want to expose an API. Well, the quickest win for you as a business, so say you're a product manager, you need to launch an API, you need to launch a developer portal, the quickest way to that is to deploy an API gateway that can mediate between SOAP and REST and JSON and do the transformations and everything, put that lipstick on, and then go out and put out a developer portal that promotes the API that you just exposed with the correct marketing messages and start building a developer community around it. So yes, I firmly believe that services infrastructure should provide that mediation. I don't think that it should be different infrastructure for services and APIs, because I think that they're doing the same job, and I think that even the developer portal that's outward-facing can be used internally. I think it's about consumption and production. So if you're consuming a service or an API, irrespective of whether it's internal or external, if you're the consumer, you go to the portal, and there you discover your APIs. And if you're a producer, if you're building these APIs or services, you use a repository and you go through a long life cycle. It might be 8 months or whatever it is to build this thing, and that's how that's managed. So I think that they divided between consumer and producer. I think it's the same infrastructure for services and APIs.
Okay. The other one is a little more basic, which goes back to, so what's technically the difference between SOA and API? Is it REST versus SOAP, or is it human readable versus it being machine readable?
Well, I don't think there's any official standings on it. I think that the difference between, and it's all about perception and what you believe. I believe that they're the same thing. But it also depends on who am I talking to, right? So from a business person's perspective, they don't care about services, or at least the traditional definition. They care about APIs, and the reason they care about APIs is that it is a product. They don't care about the protocol, that's for sure. They don't care about anything, really, except the fact that it's a business product, and how they're going to market it and promote it, and how they're going to get as many people as they can to use it. So I think that the fundamental difference between an API, I don't even like putting things in these buckets, but I think that the fundamental difference between an API and a service is that the one is a product and the other one is not. There's no, yes, there are generally accepted technical differences between the things, but as I say, technology just moves, and it's going to move irrespective of what we call these things or what we label these things. So API and SOA to me have no difference in terms of technology. Some people think it's internal versus external. I don't think that either. I see a lot of APIs being used internally. I think it's more of a product versus, or API is more of a product than a service ever was. But again, I don't even like putting those things in those buckets.
Okay. So the next one is, what is wrong in the API platform? I mean, so you have these SOA platforms and you have API platforms. So what's wrong with the API platform?
Well, the same thing that's wrong with it is also the thing that's right with it. APIs are quick and easy and agile. So it's very, very, you can get an API up and running very, very quickly. And what I do not want to do is kill APIs by imposing a huge burden on top of them. So what you have to do as an organization is you have to balance the agility of the API and even the consumer, because the people you're marketing this API to, they have very short attention spans, right? You want to move with technology, and technology is continually accelerating. So you want to keep your API program as agile as possible. But at the same time, it's integrating into a whole bunch of different back-end systems and doing a whole bunch of integration with those systems. And you need to take care of certain elements of governance and control associated with it. So what's wrong with APIs today is that people tend to dismiss everything on the back end. They tend to just take the shortcuts, do what's quick, do what's easy, expose the API, which works fine for the first couple of times, doesn't scale well, and you don't really understand what the back end is doing and how it's serving up those front ends. So it's a little bit undisciplined. But at the same time, what you need to be aware of as an API program manager is the balance between the agility you need with your outward-facing API and the reality of dealing with back-end systems that tend to be a little bit more immovable. So that's why we introduced the gateway, to give you that flexibility, to give you that ability to route and orchestrate, so that the API program manager has the flexibility in the middle to maintain an agile API front end with potentially a stodgier back end, you know, and understand what the relationships are and track the transaction all the way through and provide visibility and change management across the board. So I think, you know, I think that sums it up.
Yep. I have one more question, and the lines are all unmuted, but I have time for one more question. I have a lot of questions over here. I'll take one more question from my repository, and if somebody wants to ask a live question, they can ask that as well. Okay, so I will add one more question. So one of the customers is asking, like, they have already an ESB in place with some 400 services being managed by ESB. So where does like a SOA management platform fits in with customers who already have ESB infrastructures in place when they want to roll out an API platform?
Right. So we typically sit on top of the ESB. Not on top, but you deploy our infrastructure and we communicate with the ESB. So the API gateway, its role is not to encompass a lot of business logic. That already sits in your ESB. And ESBs, as a rule, the industry kind of made a mess of the ESB. The ESB was supposed to be an enterprise service broker, and it was supposed to route service-based transactions. It ended up being an excuse to sell application service. And basically, the more complicated they could make it, the better. So what ended up happening is that every single sort of religious affiliation within your organization to Java or to .NET or to whatever ended up having their own ESB and ended up using it for integration purposes. So the ESB was, and the message around the ESB was hugely diluted. So what ends up happening is that ESB is typically owned by some organization within your company, and it is bogged down in process and change management. So what customers need to do is they need to get an API gateway that interfaces with those ESBs. And I'm not saying that this is the perfect fit for everybody, but if you're trying to get an agile program out there, support an API, mediate between APIs and services, do some lightweight orchestration based on standards-based interfaces, then our gateway is a better choice than an ESB, because an ESB is fat and slow. So we tend to layer above a multitude of different ESBs from different lines of business to create the API and expose that to the outside world. So that you can use your ESB if you own it. And that's not always the case, right? You don't always own that ESB.
Okay. That's it. I think we are on the top of the hour. We have run over the time for this, but
all right.
Thank you everyone for joining. We will send you the link to the recording of this webinar, and thank you very much, Alistair.
Thank you. Thank you.